There exists a portrait in the climate-controlled archives of the New York Historical Society, carefully preserved behind glass that filters harmful light. It shows a young woman in an elaborate white gown, her dark hair arranged in the Gibson Girl style fashionable in the early 1890s. She sits in a velvet chair, hands folded demurely in her lap, and she is smiling. The brass plate beneath reads, Miss Cordelia Ashworth, Spring 1892, Ashworth Manor, Newport, Rhode Island. At first glance, it appears to be an unremarkable society portrait, one of thousands commissioned during America's Gilded Age, when newly wealthy families sought to establish their legitimacy through art and ostentation. But what makes this particular portrait extraordinary, what has made it the subject of whispered speculation among historians and occult researchers for over a century, is a single, verified, impossible fact. Cordelia Ashworth died in February 1892, 3 months before this portrait was painted. The America of the late 19th century was a nation transformed almost overnight by industrial might and concentrated wealth beyond comprehension. While immigrants crowded into fetid tenements and children worked 14-hour shifts in factories, men like Carnegie, Rockefeller, and Vanderbilt accumulated fortunes that would dwarf the treasuries of European nations. It was an era of breathtaking excess and crushing poverty, of rapid technological advancement and stubborn social Darwinism, of scientific rationalism and, paradoxically, an obsessive fascination with spiritualism and the possibility of communicating with the dead. Into this world of stark contradictions came the Ashworth family, relative newcomers to the aristocracy of wealth. Malcolm Ashworth had built his fortune through steel mills in Pittsburgh, investments in railway expansion, and a willingness to crush labor organizing with methods that made even his fellow robber barons uncomfortable. By 1885, his personal wealth was estimated at $47 million, and he had done what all newly wealthy men aspired to do. He had built a summer cottage in Newport, Rhode Island. The term cottage was, of course, a deliberate understatement practiced by the wealthy to display their refined sensibilities. Ashworth Manor was a 52-room Italian Renaissance palazzo that had cost $3 million to construct and furnish. Its ballroom could accommodate 300 guests. Its wine cellar was carved from solid bedrock, and its art collection, assembled with more money than taste, included works attributed to old masters, though several would later prove to be clever forgeries. Malcolm Ashworth had 3 children, 2 sons who managed various aspects of his business empire, and 1 daughter. Cordelia was born in 1874, making her 18 years old in 1892. By all accounts, she was an unusually beautiful young woman with pale skin, dark hair, and eyes that contemporaries described as disconcertingly intelligent for a female. She had been educated by private tutors, spoke French and Italian fluently, played piano at a professional level, and displayed an unfortunate tendency toward reading philosophy and attending lectures on subjects considered inappropriate for young ladies of her station. Her father viewed her primarily as a valuable asset to be deployed strategically. In the marriage market of Gilded Age high society, a beautiful, accomplished daughter of immense wealth could secure alliances with old money families who possessed the one thing Malcolm Ashworth's millions couldn't buy: generations of established social legitimacy. He had already identified several suitable prospects among the sons of declining but respectable New York and Boston families who would trade their names for Ashworth money. But Cordelia Ashworth had different plans. She had fallen in love with a man her father considered utterly unsuitable, a portrait painter named Thomas Blackwell. Blackwell was 32 years old, moderately successful in artistic circles, and completely unacceptable to Malcolm Ashworth. He possessed no fortune, no family connections, no prospects beyond his talent with brush and canvas. He was, in Ashworth's estimation, a parasite who painted flattering portraits of wealthy people in exchange for money. That his daughter might actually love this man, that she might value intellectual and emotional connection over social positioning, was incomprehensible to Malcolm Ashworth. When he discovered their courtship in January 1892, his reaction was swift and brutal. Cordelia was forbidden from leaving the Newport estate. Her correspondence was monitored. The servants were instructed to report any attempts at communication with Blackwell. and Ashworth made it clear to Thomas Blackwell, through intermediaries who were not gentle in their persuasion, that any further contact with Cordelia would result in consequences that would extend beyond mere social ruin. What happened next has been pieced together from multiple sources. Servants' testimonies, Blackwell's incomplete journals, letters that survived, and most disturbingly, a detailed confession written by Malcolm Ashworth himself decades later, discovered after his death in 1923. The confession was suppressed by the Ashworth family, but a copy found its way into the hands of a researcher in 1967, finally providing answers to questions that had haunted the case for 75 years. In February 1892, Cordelia Ashworth attempted to escape. She had managed to smuggle a letter to Thomas Blackwell through a sympathetic housemaid, arranging a meeting in the gardens at midnight on February 14th. They would elope, she wrote, traveling to California, where her father's influence wouldn't reach, where they could marry and build a life based on love rather than social calculation. But Malcolm Ashworth had informants everywhere. The housemaid who delivered the letter also reported its contents to the head butler, who immediately informed his employer. Ashworth made his own plans, and on that February night, when Cordelia slipped from her bedroom and made her way through the frost-covered gardens toward the rear gate where Blackwell waited, her father was ready. What precisely occurred in those gardens remains partially obscured, but the outcome is documented. There was a confrontation. Voices were raised, and then Cordelia Ashworth was struck. Accounts differ on whether by her father's hand or by one of the men he had brought with him. She fell, her head connecting with the marble edge of an ornamental fountain. The impact was fatal. The coroner, a man who owed his position to Ashworth's political influence, would later record the death as resulting from a tragic accident, a young woman who suffered a dizzy spell during a midnight stroll. Thomas Blackwell, who witnessed everything from his position beyond the gate, fled into the night. He would never paint again. He would die in an asylum in 1897, driven mad, some said, by what he had seen in the Ashworth Gardens, though the nature of his delusions was never properly recorded. And Cordelia Ashworth was buried in a private ceremony in the family mausoleum on the estate grounds. Her father commissioned a marble angel to mark her resting place, an angel whose face bore no resemblance to his daughter's actual features. The inscription read simply, "Beloved daughter, gone too soon." This should have been the end of the story. A tragedy, certainly, a waste of a young life, but not uncommon in an era when women had few rights and fathers possessed near absolute authority over their daughters. But Malcolm Ashworth's relationship with his daughter did not end with her death. In fact, it was only beginning to evolve into something far more disturbing. Ashworth's confession, written in the shaking hand of a 78-year-old man confronting his own mortality, reveals a descent into obsession that began within days of Cordelia's burial. He had not intended to kill his daughter. This fact tormented him. He had merely meant to stop her, to prevent her from throwing away her position and his carefully laid plans. The blow that killed her had been, in his mind, accidental. But dead she remained, and with her death came guilt that Malcolm Ashworth's autocratic personality was utterly unprepared to process. He began spending hours in the mausoleum, talking to Cordelia's marble coffin. He had her bedroom preserved exactly as she had left it, forbidding anyone from entering or cleaning it. He commissioned multiple portraits from memory, each one attempting to capture her expression, her spirit, the essential quality of her presence that death had stolen. But none satisfied him. They were all lifeless, empty, failing to capture what he now realized he had taken for granted when she lived. It was in March 1892, approximately 1 month after Cordelia's death, that Malcolm Ashworth first encountered the spiritualist movement that was sweeping through American high society. Seances had become fashionable entertainment among the wealthy, a way to add mystical excitement to dinner parties. The idea that the dead could communicate with the living, that the veil between worlds was permeable, resonated powerfully in a nation dealing with the trauma of the Civil War and the rapid social changes of industrialization. Ashworth attended his first seance at the home of a business associate in New York City. The medium was a woman named Madame Vestara, who had achieved considerable fame among Manhattan's elite for her apparent ability to contact deceased relatives. During that initial session, conducted in a darkened parlor with the attendees holding hands around a circular table, Madame Vestara claimed to make contact with Cordelia's spirit. The messages were vague, as they always were in such performances. Words of forgiveness, expressions of peace, the standard reassurances that the dead were happy in their celestial realm. But for Malcolm Ashworth, desperate for absolution and willing to believe, it was enough. He became obsessed with spiritualism, attending multiple seances each week, consulting various mediums, spending extraordinary sums on anyone who claimed ability to pierce the veil between life and death. Most were charlatans, of course. The spiritualist movement, while sincere for some practitioners and believers, had attracted numerous frauds who exploited grieving families for profit. They employed techniques that would later be thoroughly exposed: hidden assistants producing spirit voices, phosphorescent paint creating ghostly apparitions, elaborate mechanisms making tables move and objects levitate. But whether the phenomena were genuine or fabricated mattered less than the psychological need they fulfilled. Malcolm Ashworth needed to believe his daughter's spirit survived and could forgive him. It was through these spiritualist circles that Ashworth met Elias Crane in April 1892. Crane was not a medium himself, but rather what he termed a spiritual philosopher, who studied the theories underlying communication with the deceased. He had traveled extensively through India and Egypt, studying various mystical traditions. He claimed to possess knowledge of ancient practices that went far beyond the parlor trick seances that had become popular in America and Europe. Crane was in his 50s, gaunt and intense, with eyes that seemed to look through rather than at the people he spoke with. He dressed in black clothing that had vaguely ecclesiastical qualities without belonging to any specific religious tradition. And he spoke with absolute confidence about matters that most people, even committed spiritualists, considered speculative at best. He told Malcolm Ashworth something that no other medium or spiritualist had dared suggest: that it was possible not merely to communicate with the dead, but to bring them back. Not resurrection in the Christian sense, not a restoration of actual biological life, but something more complex. A binding of the spirit to the physical world, a forcing open of the doorway between realms that death had closed. It required specific conditions, Crane explained. The death must be recent. There must be a powerful emotional bond between the deceased and the living, and there must be willingness to pay a price, though Crane was initially vague about what exactly that price entailed. Malcolm Ashworth, consumed by guilt and the pathological need to control even death itself, agreed without hesitation. Money was no object. He would pay anything, do anything, to have his daughter back in some form. Crane's price was $50,000, a staggering sum even for a man of Ashworth's wealth, plus access to Cordelia's body and complete privacy to conduct the necessary rituals. What occurred in the Ashworth family mausoleum during 3 nights in late April 1892 has never been fully documented. No servants were permitted on the grounds. Malcolm Ashworth assisted Crane personally, though his later confession reveals little about the specific practices employed. He mentions chants in languages he didn't recognize, the burning of substances that produced smoke with nauseating odors, geometric patterns drawn in various materials around Cordelia's opened coffin, and a ritual that required Ashworth's own blood to be mixed with grave soil and applied to his daughter's preserved corpse. On the 3rd night, according to Ashworth's confession, something happened. The temperature in the mausoleum dropped precipitously. Candles flickered in the absence of any breeze, and Cordelia's corpse opened its eyes. What returned was not entirely Cordelia Ashworth. Ashworth himself acknowledged this in his confession, describing his daughter's reanimated form as wearing Cordelia's face like an ill-fitting mask. The entity spoke with her voice, but the cadence was wrong. It moved with her body, but the gestures were not quite right. It possessed her memories, but related them with an odd detachment, as though describing events that had happened to someone else. Elias Crane explained that the binding was imperfect, as such things always were. The spirit he had called back was Cordelia's, but it was also something else, something that had attached itself during the process of crossing between worlds. The veil between life and death, once torn open, attracted other presences. Some of what inhabited Cordelia's restored body was his daughter. Some was not. Malcolm Ashworth, having come this far, having already crossed into territory that his rational business mind would have once considered impossible, accepted this explanation. His daughter was back, partially at least, and that was enough. Crane departed with his payment, offering a final warning that Ashworth largely ignored. The binding would not hold forever, and when it failed, the results would be unpredictable and likely catastrophic. For the next several weeks, Malcolm Ashworth maintained an elaborate pretense. Cordelia had not died, he told the household staff. She had merely been very ill, confined to her room, and was now recovering. The servants who had attended her funeral were dismissed with generous severance payments and veiled threats regarding confidentiality. New staff was hired, people who had never known Cordelia Ashworth in life and therefore had no basis for comparison. The reanimated Cordelia was kept largely isolated within Ashworth Manor. She appeared at carefully controlled times, usually in dim lighting that obscured the unnatural pallor of her skin and the fixed quality of her gaze. She spoke little, which Ashworth explained as lingering weakness from her illness, and she obeyed her father with an absolute compliance that the living Cordelia had never demonstrated. This should have satisfied Malcolm Ashworth. He had his daughter back, or at least a version of her. She was under his control completely. But the presence of the reanimated Cordelia began to have effects that Ashworth had not anticipated. The other servants, even those who had never known the original Cordelia, found her disturbing. They reported that she sometimes stood motionless in corridors for hours, staring at nothing, that she occasionally spoke in languages no one recognized, that the air around her always felt several degrees colder than normal, that small animals refused to enter any room she occupied. Ashworth dismissed these concerns, attributing them to superstitious anxiety among the lower classes. But privately, he too was beginning to realize that what he had brought back was becoming less recognizable as his daughter with each passing day. The entity was learning, adapting, but in directions that seemed increasingly alien. It asked strange questions about the nature of physical existence, about pain, about the boundaries between different forms of matter. It requested books on anatomy, chemistry, and physics, studying them with an intensity that suggested purposes Ashworth preferred not to consider. It was in this context, in May 1892, that Malcolm Ashworth made his most inexplicable decision. He commissioned Thomas Blackwell to paint a portrait of Cordelia. The reasoning, as explained in Ashworth's confession, was both simple and profoundly disturbed. He wanted evidence, visual proof that his daughter had returned. He wanted a portrait that would show Cordelia as she now existed, alive and smiling, a demonstration to himself and potentially to posterity that he had succeeded in overcoming death itself. And there was perhaps a deeper, darker motivation. He wanted to prove his power to the man who had tried to steal his daughter, to show Thomas Blackwell that Malcolm Ashworth's will extended beyond even the grave. Blackwell was located in a boarding house in Boston, living under an assumed name, his mental state already deteriorating. Ashworth's agents brought him to Newport, not gently, and presented him with an offer that was not actually optional. Paint a portrait of Cordelia Ashworth, receive $50,000, and then disappear forever to wherever he wished. Refuse, and face consequences related to his alleged role in Cordelia's death that Ashworth could easily fabricate. What Thomas Blackwell experienced during the week he spent at Ashworth Manor, painting the portrait that now resides in the New York Historical Society, can only be partially reconstructed. He kept fragmentary notes, discovered years later among his possessions when he died in the asylum. These notes, written in increasingly erratic handwriting, suggest a man confronting something his rational mind could not process. He wrote about Cordelia's appearance, describing her as simultaneously beautiful and repulsive. Her features were exactly as he remembered, but there was something fundamentally wrong in the proportions, in the way light seemed to interact strangely with her skin, in the absolute stillness she maintained while posing. He noted that she never blinked, that she never appeared to breathe, that the smile she held for hours at a time never wavered or showed any sign of muscular fatigue. He wrote about her eyes, describing them as windows to somewhere that is not heaven and not hell, but a third place for which we have no name. He documented how she watched him while he painted, and how her watching felt like being studied by something that was learning to mimic humanity by observing his reactions. And he recorded something that terrified him more than anything else: recognition. Whatever inhabited Cordelia's form recognized him, remembered him, and regarded him with an attention that was not quite hostility and not quite curiosity, but something in between. The portrait itself is remarkably beautiful from a technical standpoint. Blackwell was a talented artist, and even in his deteriorating mental state, his skill did not abandon him. Cordelia is depicted in perfect detail, wearing a white gown that suggests both wedding dress and shroud. Her hands are folded in her lap in a pose of demure composure. Her hair is arranged elegantly, and she is smiling, a gentle, enigmatic smile that seems to invite the viewer into some private understanding. But there are details, subtle wrongnesses that become apparent upon careful examination. The shadow cast by her figure doesn't quite match the implied light sources in the composition. The reflection in the vase of flowers beside her shows her face from an impossible angle. And most disturbing, there appears to be a faint double image, as though two separate entities are occupying the same space, visible only when light hits the canvas from specific directions. Blackwell completed the portrait in 7 days. He signed it, accepted the payment from Malcolm Ashworth, and left Newport that same evening. Within a month, he had been institutionalized, suffering from what doctors termed acute melancholia with delusional features. His ravings, according to asylum records, centered on themes of stolen souls, animate corpses, and the impossibility of truly closing doors once they had been opened. He died in 1897, officially from pneumonia, though the nurse who found his body reported that his face was frozen in an expression of absolute terror, and that his final words, repeated over and over, were, "She's still smiling. Why is she still smiling?" The portrait was hung in Ashworth Manor's main gallery, where Malcolm Ashworth could view it daily. It represented in his increasingly fragmented mind proof of his victory over death, evidence that his will was supreme even over natural law. He had his daughter back, or something wearing her form, and he had visual documentation that she existed, that she smiled, that she was, in some definition of the term, alive. But the presence of the reanimated Cordelia was having wider effects on the household and the surrounding area. Servants continued to leave despite generous wages, reporting nightmares, feelings of being watched, and unexplainable phenomena. The gardens around the manor began to die despite careful maintenance, plants withering as though drained of vitality, and most disturbingly, there were disappearances. A stable boy vanished in June 1892. A housemaid disappeared in July. Both were eventually found in the sub-basement of the manor, in a locked room that had previously been used for storing wine. They were not dead, not exactly, but they were no longer entirely alive either. They existed in a state that physicians called cataleptic, unresponsive to stimuli, breathing but not conscious, their bodies cold to the touch despite faint heartbeats. Malcolm Ashworth had them quietly removed to a private sanitarium he owned in upstate New York, where they were kept in isolation. They never recovered consciousness. And Ashworth, confronted now with evidence that his reanimated daughter was doing something to the household staff, did not stop the process or send the entity away. He rationalized, he made excuses, he convinced himself that these were unfortunate side effects but not reasons to abandon his achievement. The entity that wore Cordelia's form was evolving, learning, adapting to existence in the physical world. It had begun leaving the manor at night, walking through the grounds with a gliding motion that servants reported as not quite walking. It was seen in the village of Newport, always at night, always alone, standing motionless in front of shops and homes as though studying them. It visited graveyards, standing among the tombstones for hours, perfectly still, seeming to communicate with something invisible to human observers. And it was feeding. The cataleptic victims represented what it needed, not flesh or blood in the traditional sense, but something more essential: Life force, perhaps, or the electromagnetic energy that animates living bodies. The entity was consuming what kept humans vital, leaving behind empty shells that technically lived but lacked anything that could be called consciousness or soul. Malcolm Ashworth, by August 1892, understood that he had made a catastrophic mistake. But his personality, formed by decades of accumulating wealth and power through ruthless determination, could not admit error or defeat. He had invested too much, gone too far, crossed too many boundaries. To acknowledge that his daughter's resurrection was actually an abomination would be to face guilt he was psychologically incapable of processing. So instead, he did what powerful men often do when confronted with consequences of their actions. He tried to contain and control. He hired guards, ostensibly to protect the estate, but actually to keep the reanimated Cordelia from leaving the grounds. He consulted other spiritualists and occult practitioners, seeking methods to stabilize the entity, or at least limit its activities. And he continued to maintain the public fiction that his daughter was alive, going so far as to plan a society event where she would be formally reintroduced to Newport's elite circles. This ball, scheduled for September 15, 1892, never occurred. On September 12th, 3 days before the planned event, Elias Crane returned to Ashworth Manor unannounced. He demanded to see Malcolm Ashworth immediately, and when admitted to his presence, delivered a warning that Ashworth recorded in his confession. The binding was failing. The entity was becoming unstable. And when the binding finally broke, which would happen soon, the results would be devastating not just for the household but potentially for a much wider area. Crane explained that what he had summoned was not merely Cordelia's spirit. It was a being from what he termed the spaces between, attracted by the ritual's opening of dimensional boundaries. It had merged partially with Cordelia's essence, using her memories and form to anchor itself in physical reality. But it was fundamentally incompatible with this plane of existence. Its presence created distortions, weakened the barriers between life and death, and attracted other entities that were beginning to gather around Ashworth Manor, like moths drawn to flame. The only solution, Crane insisted, was to reverse the ritual, to unmake what had been made, to send the entity back through the open door and then seal that door forever. It would require destroying Cordelia's body completely, burning it at a specific hour under specific conditions, while performing a banishment ritual that would close the dimensional breach. Malcolm Ashworth refused. He had paid Crane to bring his daughter back, not to destroy her again. He ordered Crane removed from the property, threatening legal action and worse if he ever returned. Crane left, but not before warning that Ashworth had perhaps 2 weeks before the binding collapsed entirely, and that when it did, he should flee as far from Newport as possible. Ashworth dismissed this warning as manipulation, an attempt by Crane to extract more money. But the entity itself was displaying increasingly disturbing changes. It had stopped maintaining the pretense of being Cordelia. It no longer responded to her name, no longer engaged in any recognizable human behaviors. It spent hours standing perfectly motionless in the main gallery, staring at its own portrait with an attention that suggested it was learning something from the painted image. On September 20th, 1892, the binding broke. The precise sequence of events that night has been reconstructed from the testimonies of the few survivors, from physical evidence examined by investigators who arrived weeks later, and from Malcolm Ashworth's confession. At approximately 9 in the evening, every window in Ashworth Manor's main structure shattered simultaneously despite the absence of any explosion or physical force. The temperature throughout the building dropped by an estimated 30 degrees in minutes, and the entity that had been Cordelia Ashworth began to change. Its human form dissolved, not physically, but perceptually. Witnesses described seeing it as simultaneously present and absent, a space where reality itself seemed uncertain. It moved through the manor's corridors, and where it passed, the barriers between life and death became permeable. Servants saw their own dead relatives manifesting in the hallways. The very architecture seemed to shift, rooms connecting in impossible ways, spaces expanding beyond their physical dimensions. Malcolm Ashworth, confronted finally with the full horror of what he had unleashed, tried to flee. But the entity found him in his study, surrounded by ledgers documenting his business empire, the quantified evidence of his lifetime belief that money and will could overcome any obstacle. What occurred between them was witnessed by a butler who survived, though his account, given years later, has a hallucinatory quality that makes its reliability questionable. He reported that the entity spoke to Ashworth in Cordelia's voice, but with a knowledge and perspective that suggested it could see through time itself. It told him what it had learned from inhabiting human form, that love could not be commanded, that death could not be defeated, that some boundaries existed for profound reasons, and that breaking them carried costs beyond calculation. It showed him visions of the workers crushed in his steel mills, of the families destroyed by his business practices, of the countless lives ground to dust beneath his accumulation of wealth. And it showed him what waited beyond death for men like him, though the butler could not articulate what those visions contained. Malcolm Ashworth died that night. The official cause of death was recorded as heart failure, which was technically accurate in that his heart stopped beating. But his face, like Thomas Blackwell's years later, was frozen in an expression of absolute terror, and his eyes remained open, staring at something no one else could see. The entity did not stop with Malcolm Ashworth. It moved through the manor, and everyone it encountered fell into the same cataleptic state that had claimed the earlier victims. 37 people were in Ashworth Manor that night. 17 survived, fleeing into the grounds and eventually to the village. 20 were found days later, technically alive but completely unresponsive, their bodies cold and their pulses faint, existing in that terrible state between life and death that defies medical classification. And then, as dawn approached on September 21st, the entity returned to the main gallery where its portrait hung. Multiple witnesses, including the village priest who had been summoned to the scene, reported seeing a figure in white standing before the painting, perfectly motionless. As the sun rose, the figure gradually faded, becoming increasingly translucent until it vanished entirely. But the portrait changed. Where Cordelia's smile had been enigmatic, it now seemed knowing, almost mocking. And the quality of light in the painting had shifted, as though the artist had captured not early afternoon, but the precise moment of dawn. Ashworth Manor was abandoned immediately. The surviving staff refused to return. The Ashworth family, led by Cordelia's brothers, sealed the building and tried to suppress all information about what had occurred. The 20 cataleptic victims were transported to various private institutions where they remained for the rest of their natural lives, never regaining consciousness, their care paid for by Ashworth family trusts. Most lived for decades, bodies maintained through feeding tubes and constant care, but essentially absent from their own existence. The portrait was removed from the manor by investigators and eventually donated to the New York Historical Society by the Ashworth family in 1920, who wanted it as far from their possession as possible. It has remained there since, an object of fascination for researchers studying spiritualism, the Gilded Age, or the boundaries of artistic representation. Those who study the portrait carefully have noted that it seems to change subtly depending on conditions. In certain lights, Cordelia's expression appears different, less smile and more warning. The double image that Blackwell created becomes more visible at specific times of day. And there have been numerous reports over the decades from museum staff and visitors of feeling watched while viewing the portrait, of experiencing sudden temperature drops, of hearing whispers in empty galleries. Malcolm Ashworth's confession, written in 1923 when he was supposedly dead since 1892, raises questions that have never been satisfactorily answered. How could a man dead for 31 years write such a detailed document? The handwriting has been verified as his through comparison with business documents. The paper and ink date correctly to the 1920s. But Malcolm Ashworth died in 1892, witnessed by multiple people, buried in the family mausoleum, his death recorded in official documents. Unless he didn't. Unless what died that night in the manor was only his body, and something else, something of his consciousness or essence, remained trapped in the spaces the entity had opened. There are theories, unprovable but persistent, that Malcolm Ashworth continued to exist in some form, bound perhaps to the manor or to the portrait, or to the memory of his crimes against natural law. That his confession was channeled through a medium or manifested through automatic writing. That he was trying, from whatever state he occupied, to warn others against following his path. Ashworth Manor still stands, though barely. The Ashworth family sold the property in 1924 to developers who planned to demolish it and build modern homes. But construction crews refused to work on the site after 3 separate deaths occurred during preliminary demolition. Deaths officially attributed to accidents, but that workers insisted involved supernatural phenomena. The property has changed hands numerous times since, but no one has successfully developed it. It stands now, slowly collapsing under its own weight and the assault of New England weather, fenced and posted with no trespassing signs that are routinely ignored by curiosity seekers and paranormal investigators. Those who visit report experiences consistent across decades. Feelings of being watched, sudden temperature changes, apparitions of figures in Victorian dress, and most frequently the sensation of profound sadness mixed with warning, as though the place itself is trying to communicate something essential about boundaries that should not be crossed and prices that cannot be afforded. The story of Cordelia Ashworth and her father's attempts to resurrect her resonates through time because it touches on fundamental human desires and fears. The wish to undo death, to retrieve what we've lost, to exercise control over the uncontrollable. These are universal. But Cordelia's story serves as a dark parable about the costs of such desires, about the reasons certain boundaries exist, about the difference between love and possession, between grieving and refusing to let go. When we look at the portrait from 1892, at that smiling young woman in her white dress, we are confronting multiple layers of impossibility and horror. We see a dead woman painted as though alive. We see the product of a father's guilt transformed into obsession, transformed into blasphemy against natural law. We see evidence of realms beyond current understanding documented by an artist who paid for that documentation with his sanity. And we see a warning, inscribed in oil and canvas, about what happens when humans try to overcome limits that exist for profound reasons. The portrait has been examined by numerous experts over the decades. Art historians study Blackwell's technique, noting the masterful use of light and shadow, even as they puzzle over the painting's subtle impossibilities. Paranormal researchers have photographed it under various conditions, documenting anomalies that appear and disappear. Psychologists have studied the emotional responses it evokes in viewers, and philosophers have used it as a focal point for discussions about the boundaries between life and death, the nature of consciousness, and whether certain knowledge is better left unexplored. But perhaps most significantly, the portrait remains a memorial to Cordelia Ashworth herself, the actual young woman who loved and hoped and died violently in her father's garden. Before the resurrection, before the entity, before the horror, there was simply a girl who wanted to choose her own life and was denied that fundamental right. In the end, she became a vessel for something inhuman, a warning in oil paint and a story told in whispers. But she began as someone who deserved better than what her father's love, which was really control, which was really ego, which was really the inability to accept any limitation on his will, did to her. The archives of the New York Historical Society close at 5 each evening. The portrait is covered, the lights are dimmed, and the gallery is locked. And in that darkness, according to night security guards who have worked there over the decades, Cordelia Ashworth continues to smile, always smiling, always watching, always waiting to teach anyone who will listen to the lesson that costs so many people so much to learn, that death is a boundary, that boundaries exist for reasons, and that love which refuses to respect those boundaries is not love at all, but something far more terrible wearing love's name.